Welcome, everybody. It is 12:15, so we are going to get started. I'm Sarah Searle. I am a senior manager at BAO Systems, and I am really, really pleased today to be here with Austin McGee, who's a deputy technical lead at HISP at the University of Oslo. He helps lead the software team for DHIS2, focusing on platform architecture, developer advocacy, and organizational development. And he today is going to present the work of the DHIS2 security team, including an update on new security practices. He's also going to be introducing some of the new DHIS2 vulnerability management and disclosure policies, as well as the roadmap for increased security and privacy support of DHIS2 implementations. Security of our health information systems is an area that's very near and dear to my heart. I think that's why they assigned me this panel to moderate. So I'm really looking forward to hear from Austin. If you have any questions or comments, please do put them in the Q&A or chat, and we will have Q&A at the end of his presentation. So with that, I will get off screen, and Austin, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, pleasure to be here and speaking with all of you today. Security is something that is very important, critically important, and also historically undervalued or underappreciated, I guess, in the space that we work in. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the investments that the University of Oslo has been making and the core team have been making in improving security and security practices at DHIS2, both within the core team and advocating those practices through the wider community. I put a couple fairly simple polls up, so if everyone who is listening in could just go over and answer that poll when you have a moment. I'll talk a little bit about the answers to those later on. Fairly straightforward questions, hopefully nothing too tricky, but would really appreciate it if people could go and take a look at that. So thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction. Again, my name is Austin McGee. I'm the Deputy Tech Lead at DHIS2. I've been on the core team since 2018, so a few years now. And more recently moved into the role of Deputy Tech Lead, working closely with Lars to lead the software team and the technical direction of the product. And a part of that work, beginning at the end of last year, helped to convene a new security team within the core team of DHIS2 and championed some of the initiatives that we'll talk about here today. So with that, I will go ahead and move on to the next slide. We put together a set of principles along with my colleague, Bob Joliffe, who many of you may know, to basically orient our operations and our roadmap for security and how we approach it throughout the organization. Those are listed here, but I'll go ahead and read them out. This is the only time I'll try to read from the slide, but our security principles are, first and foremost, have a robust, formal, and predictable security process. This is often one of the largest deficiencies in organizations when they have when it comes to security, is that the processes aren't in place. Incidents will happen and things will go wrong in every organization and every piece of software. And if you don't have the processes in place to address those unforeseen issues when they do arise, you are going to panic and scramble, and the whole organization isn't going to know what to do or how to handle that in a responsible way. So having those processes well defined before the incident happens is very important. Another principle that we are endeavoring to embody is maximum transparency. So it can be tempting a lot of times to kind of sweep security issues under the rug in software organizations and in organizations in general, because they can be a little bit embarrassing. They can be something that maybe would be detrimental to your sales or something if you're a traditional software organization. But transparency can be a little bit painful sometimes but it is the best and only way to really promote security throughout the community and the group of stakeholders that are working with that software. And so that's our goal, is to have a maximum amount of transparency into our processes, into the security issues that do come up, into how we approach and how we worked with the community to responsibly respond to those issues. In line with that, we also endeavor towards full responsible disclosure. This means that when, in this case, I'm particularly speaking about a technical security vulnerability. I'll talk about other pieces of security a little bit later in the presentation. But when a vulnerability is discovered in DHIS2, instead of sweeping it under the rug or fixing it and not telling anyone, full responsible disclosure means that we will publicly declare that this vulnerability existed, that it was fixed, and that these were the processes that we followed to get that. The responsible part of that disclosure refers to the important aspect before actually publicly disclosing something like a vulnerability, communicating clearly and urgently with all of the implementations of DHIS2 in the wild that might be affected by this vulnerability, giving them access to patches before that disclosure is publicly made, if possible, and really promoting the secure implementations of DHIS2 before those vulnerabilities are made public. And all of this comes together in promoting and increasing our own incarnation of a strong security management culture. So this is not only relevant to software development, it also is involved in organizational management and in the processes and procedures that you put in place to deal with all sorts of different security issues that might arise. So what does it mean to have security in the DHIS2 context? This is a non-exhaustive list of some of the pieces of DHIS2 security. The one that most people will probably think of when we say security is hardening of the software itself. So this means actually implementing fixes when there's something that an attacker or a hacker could exploit in DHIS2 to get access to data that they shouldn't have access to, or to bring down the system or something like that. This is known as vulnerability management. It's resisting hackers and other bad actors that are out there and might want to target a critical system, as DHIS2 is often in the place of a digital or a critical system in many places around the world. Another thing that might come to mind is fairly kind of above the surface for security are the security features of the DHIS2 software itself. This is things like user management and sharing settings and authorities. It's also things like integrity checks and data loss prevention and audit logging and things like that. So that's another area of investment that we at the core team are working on, and is also something that is of interest to the larger community when it comes to security in DHIS2. Third, we have data privacy practices, and this is similar to security. It's not exactly the same thing, but sometimes they're kind of lumped together. Privacy is, and I say this in a later slide, privacy is something that you can't have unless you have strong software security as a baseline. So if you have great privacy practices, but your system is vulnerable to a carefully crafted hack, then you don't actually have privacy at the end of the day, because that data might be accessible to that hacker. But assuming that you build in the core foundation of software security and software hardening, there are many practices that should be put in place to protect personally identifiable information and other privacy conscious pieces of information that might be hosted in DHIS2. And the final one here, which actually is probably the biggest and most important of all of these, is information security management, which does not refer to specifically hardening of software or software security features or data privacy practices. This is the soft part of security management, which means when you hire a new employee, giving them access to certain things, and then when that employee leaves the organization, or somebody who's working at a local health facility leaves that facility, revoking their access to DHIS2, or being able to go through and audit who has key cards to different buildings or keys to different buildings, or who has access to the server, or those types of things. These are not specifically issues with any particular software. They're organizational practices that need to be put in place in order to have a secure culture and a secure process in general. So now an introduction to the DHIS2 security team. There has been a security group at the DHIS2 core team of people that are interested in and promoting security for quite a long time. Probably since near the very beginning of DHIS2 in the mid 90s, or DHIS1 in the mid 90s and DHIS2 in the mid 2000s. But it has not been a clearly defined public and formalized team within DHIS2, within the core team. So we created this official security team because one of the things we recognized is that part of that secure organization management is to have a well-defined set of people who are the security team, who are well-known, who are trusted, and are when some information, for example, is shared with the security team at DHIS2, it should be segregated into that security team until it's been triaged and the severity of that information has been recognized. So that security team has been around, as I mentioned, since the end of last year. It has representation from pretty much all of the groups within the core team. So we have representation from the development teams on tracker analytics, platform, front end, back end, Android, as well as from the implementation team that support different implementations around the world. The initial focus of that team is on software security. So the first of those, first two, I would say, of those items that we mentioned on the previous slide. And this includes the features that we build into DHIS2, as well as things like vulnerability management policies, disclosure, and how we triage and address security issues as they arise. I wanted to also point out that data privacy is not any less important than software security, but software security is a foundation upon which privacy practices and privacy tools can be built. So the initial focus is on that software security and really making that more and more robust so that we can build better data privacy practices on top of it, which is something that many implementers of DHIS2 and people on the core team are doing every single day already. So now I'm going to introduce the vulnerability management policy that we put into place at the beginning of this year and have had the unfortunate opportunity to put into practice a couple times already this year. So this is a rough outline of the process that we implemented and put together. And this is incomplete. It's been expanded since this was put together, but it's a little bit of a representation of what goes on once a vulnerability is identified and communicated to the security team. And this talks about specifically how within that team, we triage the severity and the impact of that vulnerability. We also have a matrix of how we define both severity and impact, and what that means in terms of the handling of those different types of vulnerabilities. And this workflow or this flowchart specifically talks about how we then communicate those the fixes and or not fixing that particular issue to the larger community, both the trusted list of implementations that are building DHIS2 systems in the wild, who might need to know about a vulnerability before it's made public, as well as to the public once that full disclosure process has been completed. This is part of the transparency initiative that we have at with the security team. And as another part of that, we've published a vulnerability management policy, which basically is a message to anyone who is looking at DHIS2 and trying to identify vulnerabilities or weaknesses in the security of the system, particularly when it comes to software hardening or software vulnerabilities themselves. And it explains the process, how we approach triaging and responding to those reports. It talks about what we consider in scope and out of scope for software vulnerabilities that are reported directly to the core team. For instance, if there's a misconfiguration of a particular DHIS2 instance, either a test instance that some researcher has created themselves or a country's specific instance, that is not something that the core team directly responds to. And we encourage the researchers or white hat hackers, if you will, to communicate with the person responsible for that particular DHIS2 instance, rather than communicating to the core team, who might not have any authority to make changes there. This is published on our new security website, which you can also find at dhis2.org/security, which talks about the security team, the processes that we're putting in place, and this vulnerability policy as well. Another part of the vulnerability management that we have implemented this year is release embargo. And this is something that's relatively new and interesting in the field, because when you actually fix a vulnerability, if you just push that fix into the public open source source code, that's tantamount to disclosure in many cases, because it becomes relatively trivial for someone who's looking closely at the commits to that repository to figure out what's going on and to be able to exploit implementations in the wild that haven't adopted that fix yet. And this is getting a little bit maybe on the paranoid side of security, because you would need to have somebody that's actually actively looking at that, at the commits and the code that's being pushed into DHIS2 core. You would need to have someone in that situation who could then kind of reverse engineer that fix to figure out what the issue was, find a DHIS2 instance to exploit, and some other things. So it's not just a kind of a free-for-all as soon as the code goes in, but there is something that we can do to help to prevent that, and that is our embargo mechanism. What this means is when a vulnerability is identified in a released version of DHIS2, and we know that we need to fix that vulnerability in the next patch release for that version. If we did that directly, we would go the dotted line on this slide, which is to introduce that fix directly into the next patch in the open source code base. But that runs into the issue that I just mentioned. So instead, we want to cut a new release of this major version of DHIS2, in this case 237, and we want to release that and make it available to the people that we communicate that a security fix is available for these for this version of DHIS2. If you're running 237.0, you may be vulnerable to this issue, and you need to apply this fix. We're not disclosing publicly what that vulnerability is right now to protect instances that have not yet upgraded, but we're making the fix available. And this becomes a little bit complex because we need to basically have a patch on top of the open source code that is applied at build time when we release an embargoed version of the 237.1 patch. So that might have some fixes that are in the open source code base on top of 237.0. In many cases, for a critical security vulnerability, it will be only a security fix. But the patch itself, the fix for that security vulnerability, is not open source. It's not available to everyone yet. And that's where it is considered under embargo. And we have discrete notification to the implementations that we directly work with. And we encourage people to reach out if they are not on that list and want to be on that list, who are people that we know are responsible for critical DHIS2 infrastructure in the field and should be applying that fix even before it's publicly disclosed. Once that vulnerability has been publicly disclosed, and I'll get into some of the complexities of when we actually do that disclosure in a minute, then a new version, patch version, that is identical to 237.1 embargoed is cut or released, which is 237.1. Functionally, it should be completely identical to the one that was implemented with the closed source patch, but it is now using only the open source code in the code base. And this is a trade-off because it is difficult, for instance, if you have a fork of DHIS2 and you are you take the 237.1 embargoed tag in the open source repository, that will not have the vulnerability fix until it is disclosed. So until 237.1 is actually released, the open source code base does not have the fix for that vulnerability. This is a trade-off between disclosure through fixing that vulnerability in the open, in the public sphere, and making it possible for modifications to DHIS2 to be able to adopt those fixes as well. If you are, or if there is anyone that is maintaining a fork of DHIS2 and wants to be notified and can apply those fixes in their own forks, then please reach out to myself and the security team, and we can talk about how to make that possible. Disclosure becomes a little bit more complicated when we're talking about multiple versions of DHIS2. In many cases, a vulnerability will affect not one, but multiple of the major versions that have been released, and they need to be fixed on all of them. And each of those versions of DHIS2 have separate release cycles for their patches. Usually we release about every 2 months. Sometimes for critical security vulnerabilities or performance issues, we will expedite a patch. But it might be multiple months before a fix has been created, released, and then published to all of the affected versions. It might be multiple months before that happens. And so this is one of the critical reasons why the embargo mechanism is important, because even if 236.4 is released, it might be 1 or 2 months before 234 and 235 have patches that are also addressing that vulnerability. Again, that might be expedited in the case of critical security vulnerabilities. And our policy is to embargo the vulnerability and the fix to that vulnerability until all of the affected versions have been patched, and we then disclose publicly that this vulnerability existed. We may also add, depending on the vulnerability and the speed with which we release fixes on all the affected versions, we may also add a grace period allowing implementations to upgrade before publicly disclosing. And that is also taken into account in this embargo mechanism. These slides, want to give credit to my colleague again, Bob Joliffe, who helped put these together for the annual conference with the University of Oslo. And this is focusing now on what security means to implementers of DHIS2 systems. So how do you implement a secure DHIS2 system in the field in production? The number one thing that we recommend is having a senior responsible for security. And this is more important than you might think, because a lot of times a security issue, maybe some people know, they don't know who to talk to, and they don't know who it is who has the power to say, this is an issue that we need to fix, let's fix it in this way. So having somebody who is that person responsible for security and has the ability to make those high-level decisions is very important. In the context of DHIS2 itself, it's important for that person also to be in contact with the DHIS2 security team, as well as other security teams for other software that might be used by the organization. So this is, in few cases, this might be somebody who focuses exclusively on DHIS2 security, because DHIS2 has a lot of other things around it. And an organization that uses DHIS2 is not just often not just a technology organization building DHIS2. They might be a Ministry of Health, or they might be an implementation support organization, and they might be maintaining DHIS2 systems for other governments, for example. And in all of those cases, it's important to be in contact with the different security personnel or security contact people, advocates in the different organizations that build the software you work with. There are also often local, country, and regional incident response teams, specifically around information security. So it's important to be aware of and in contact with those people if your country or region has one. It's also important to have a security plan. So this is something that is often underrated, sorry. But you need to have a plan when it comes to backup, when it comes to user management, version management, and advocacy of security within your organization. And you need to continuously refine that plan as the situations evolve. A few critical tips specifically around DHIS2. Again, there's a lot of other software and other organizational things that you might need to manage with DHIS2. But specifically with DHIS2, it's important to plan and budget for major upgrade about once a year. We only provide security support for the last 3 major versions of DHIS2. Occasionally, we'll critical fixes to earlier versions, but in order to make sure you're getting the most secure, latest version of DHIS2, it's important to as quickly as possible. And it's also important to have a budget for that, because that's not quickly as possible, because we'll often have a security vulnerability, or sometimes we'll have a security vulnerability fix, and that vulnerability might be publicly disclosed and make your system vulnerable in the near future. Testing and backups are also critically important. Backups are, this was one of the poll questions, but absolutely should be a part of a security plan, because data integrity and data loss are a part of security. They may not be the same as adversarial security, where you have someone that is actively trying to harm your system, but if your system is harmed due to negligence or lack of a backup plan or lack of backup storage, that is also a problem. And then finally, managing users and roles is critically important. Just kind of a wrap up of what we've talked about. We have a security team at the DHIS2 core team at the University of Oslo. We are working to improve our organizational transparency and to increase the knowledge of and work around security within the developer team, which is important if you have auditors that are looking at DHIS2 to point them to some of those policies and practices that the DHIS2 core team is implementing. We have a vulnerability management policy, and we are working on of vulnerabilities, which means that implementations should make sure to stay up to date, at least with the latest patch version of the major version that they're running. Going forward from here, more of what we're doing, focusing on moving from software security into data privacy, and also looking at personally identifiable information, which is again addressed today, but is something that we want to increase our focus on in the near future. We are also making a number of steps towards increasing the security presence at the University of Oslo core team. One of the major ones there is to hire a dedicated senior information security manager who will take on a little bit of the role that I've stepped to and be focused on managing with advocating for it in the larger community. We've also implementing security features and practices for implementers. So with that, I think I might be a little bit over time. Apologies. Oh, 1 minute. I would love to hear any questions that anyone has or just would like to discuss.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. Definitely some questions coming in the Q&A. I, for one, am just thrilled by your presentation. I couldn't agree more with the first statement you made, that sort of in the health and development sectors that sometimes security has been kind of traditionally undervalued or maybe seen as a barrier to innovation or something like that, when really, I mean, my humble opinion is that considering the types of populations that a lot of our DHIS2 implementations work with, you know, people who might be vulnerable because of health status or immigration status or anything else, you know, we should be focusing more on security than in other types of implementation. So thank you for that note. I'll start off with an easy one for you. Folks are interested to know how to get on the list to be notified about the vulnerabilities, or is that shared with the DHIS2 community list? Oh, I think you're muted, Austin. You might be a little frozen. Can you hear us? Oh, no, I think we lost Austin. Send him a chat. Oh, he's gone. Bob, would you like to join us? Hello. Hi, Bob. Thanks for stepping in. How lucky are we?
Yeah, have you got me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. It looks like Austin's joining us again too. Feel free to stay on, Bob. Austin, we're having a few connection issues with you, but we have you now. Maybe turn off screen share in your video if you need to. So the first question, just to repeat, was folks are interested in knowing how to get on the list to be notified about vulnerabilities, that sort of communication phase that you mentioned before the embargo release.
Yeah, so I reach out to security@dhis2.org. You're also welcome to reach out to Bob or I directly. And we will get in touch. That is something that we want to. We don't want it to be a publicly accessible list, because then the wrong people could get on that list as well. So we will want to make sure that we are talking to you and seeing what implementation you're supporting and what and how we can best communicate with you.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead,
can I add while I'm it might be worth bearing in mind, I suppose, that if you're not on that list, right, it doesn't mean that you're now sort of obscured by this cloak of secrecy, because as soon as you see that there's been an embargoed release, right, then that's a signal. People need to look out for those. Once you've seen an embargoed release, then you know that there's going to be a full disclosure at some point down the line. So the clock is now ticking, and you need to actually upgrade. And some inquiries that we had this is on my head, we had it quite recently. One organization got in touch saying, we see there's this embargoed release. How long have we got? Because we know we need to upgrade, but it's going to take a bit of time, and there's things with ducks we need to put into a row. And so they want to know, well, how serious is the vulnerability? And we were able to because we knew who they were, we were able to give them a little bit of information in terms of at least the severity and the like. But the point is, I guess, if you're not on the list, you're not completely in the dark. If you see the embargoed release, you know something is happening. You can reach out to probably best security at DHIS2.org, which Austin and me and a good number of others will also see.
Yeah. I think along those lines, there's a really great question that really resonates with me. And when I am not moderating the DHIS2 symposium, I manage a very large global instance of DHIS2. And the question is around how to balance the need to apply patches with the need to test that deployment, and how essential is speed and the need to resolve security vulnerabilities. I feel this very deeply. This is not a knock on UIO, but we do experience regression sometimes in patch updates. And so we like to do our regression testing before we do stuff. But sometimes it does really feel like the clock is ticking if we know that there is a really critical security issue. So curious about how sort of the art versus the science there.
I can take a first stab at that. This is something that we deal with as well, to a little bit of a different extent. So when we're talking about getting a fix out as quickly as possible for fixing a vulnerability, we also want to make sure that that fix doesn't introduce a regression. And so we have a trade-off of getting the fix out as quickly as possible, because this is something that we know exists, and testing that as thoroughly as possible. And we definitely want to err, especially when it's a quick fix for a particular security vulnerability, we want to err on the side of testing it quite thoroughly before getting it out the door. In that case, for those kind of critical security vulnerabilities, they should be something that is just a single fix on top of the previous patch. So the best practice or best advice I could give, and Bob probably has better advice that I'll let him share in a minute, is to stay on top of the patch updates as much as possible, even if they're not security updates. Just stay on top of the patch updates with the major version that you're following, so that if a critical security vulnerability is discovered and fixed in another patch release, it will be an incremental change on top of what you already have. So the risk should be much lower in terms of regressions there. Bob, would you have other advice in terms of balancing regression testing and patch adoption?
I think in terms of balance, I find myself in greater sympathy with the people who are complaining about the regression. So I've been on the painful.
I wasn't complaining. It's normal.
Well, you should. All I can say, I think, is that if we look at where we were maybe 3 years ago, where there was no process around security really, and the testing was pretty substandard. I think testing has improved dramatically over 3 years. It's still not where we want it to be. I mean, there's still going to be the risk of regression, and the problem, as long as there is that risk of regression, it's really hard to persuade people that they need to do the next patch release, because everybody's been burned at some stage. So yeah, look, it's an imperfect world. All I can say is I think we're getting better at the testing, and the more pressure we get back from implementers to say this is not acceptable, the better we'll get.
Yeah. Well, and I think this really gets to a point that Austin made quite a few times, and actually I think in some of your slides, Bob, around the fact that sort of like being a responsible, good DHIS2 implementer in terms of keeping up with maintenance actually only enhances your security. So you might not be making those patch upgrades due to security reasons, but you are in a better place once the time comes that you do need to make a critical security upgrade. So really good thoughts there. A note from Nicola saying, thank you for pointing out that upgrades need to be planned and budgeted. Too often we see organizations that don't think about the level of effort and time involved with upgrading and deployment. I could not agree more. In fact, I just upgraded a DHIS2 instance, and it took me like 1.5 years to get through all the testing involved to do it. So couldn't agree more. a couple very specific questions, actually really interesting. I'm not sure this is the right fora for it, but we'll see. We hear much about ransomware nowadays targeting national systems. Typically, this refers to like an infrastructural system, but it seems that it could apply to an HMIS2. Does UIO think about this at all? Is this not a risk for our implementations? Any thoughts there?
I don't know how many of you know, but I live in Ireland. And you've seen on the news that our health service executive got major ransomware attack over the summer. We still haven't fully recovered from that. We think a lot, I guess, about the sort of threat assessment to the kind of data that's in DHIS2 systems and how that compares maybe to what's in the health service executive in Ireland or major hospital in New York or whatever it might be. I think there are qualitative differences. I think a lot of the ransomware attacks, I mean, anyone who's looking for a ransom is generally after the money. And so, yeah, the financial incentives probably of hacking DHIS2 systems is probably less than a large public hospital. But I think there are other fears around. And there's a bit more political motivation, I guess, in terms of people often have a motive for discrediting. They may want to discredit the software. It may be a political dispute. They want to discredit the Ministry of Health or individuals within it. So I fear those more than ransomware attacks. It's the kind of attacks which are done to discredit organizations or people.
And again, really more around sort of people and process than any sort of security hardening that UIO could do. So yeah, really interesting. Some interesting questions coming in about specific features of DHIS2. I don't know if we can answer this here, but is there a security concern about the ability for Tracker to email arbitrary addresses? In other words, that aren't associated with DHIS2 users. This is referring, I think, to sort of the email widget that can be activated in the Tracker Capture app. I don't know if that's on your radar at all, Austin.
If someone has an exploit in mind, please keep it to yourself and then share it with the security.dhis2.org list. Obviously, there are, in every DHIS2 system, there are going to be ways to configure it insecurely. And there are some features that can be more easily configured to be insecure. And so building some guidance around how to deploy secure DHIS2 configurations is something that is top of our list. With this particular feature, yes, there may be some data leakage in that case. I could imagine if you have users that are entering the wrong email addresses or something for those in that Tracker widget, and so you're sending maybe some patient data to the wrong person. So that could be a security issue that you might address with some better training or better auditing maybe of those of your Tracker system. And I'm sure there are other ways to harden that as well, turning off that feature, for example, or using another mechanism to communicate with those users. But so I think there are always going to be security is always about managing risk, and there's never going to be zero risk in any situation. I don't think this is exactly a case of the risk being particularly high, but there are ways to set it up or to exploit those types of systems.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much. We're nearing the end of the hour, and like I said, I'm really grateful for this discussion and really excited to see UIO sort of formalizing that security team. So thanks so much for your transparency and sharing this with us, Austin, and Bob as well. Thanks for your guest appearance. We have about a 30. We have about.
I thought you died, Austin.
I did too.
No, you gotta make sure to delete my DHIS2 account if that happens. That's an important security rule.
You didn't have a slide about that. So thanks everybody again.